Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm super excited to have Joanne Fallis on this morning from Fallis Immigration Consulting. Why don't you say hi, Joanne, and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into helping producers get temporary foreign workers here into Ontario. Is it just Ontario too, or is it Canada?
It is all over Canada. So good morning, Keith.
Perfect.
Thanks for having
Yep.
me. So I do work all over Canada. There is some restrictions based on different provinces, but we'll kind of focus on Ontario this morning because that's where my primary business is. So I started immigration consulting because I grew up on a dairy farm, and 8 years ago, we struggled with filling labor, having consistency in labor, having people show up to work. Yeah, all the fun stuff that comes along with having employees, which, you know, it falls across many sectors, not just agriculture. I assisted with our first LMIA, and we worked with an outside company. And once we started with that, there were some other producers that had reached out and just wanted some more information, how the process went, what we thought of the process. And at that time, we were kind of, the start of COVID. So I went back to school and became a licensed immigration consultant. And that was about a 1.5 year program. And from there on, I started consulting, and I consult only with farms. So I only do primary agriculture at this point. And I assist with farms and helping, to kind of understand the process, get the documents that they need in place, and just make sure that, everybody knows what's going on, what the best process is, and just meeting the requirements of the temporary foreign worker program.
Yeah, is there a lot of kind of bureaucracy involved in that then?
There is and there isn't. I would say it's a fairly straightforward program, but there is changes that come through the program. There is paperwork that's required that a lot of producers just don't want to have to deal with. And I would say that it is issued, like LMIAs is what it's called. They are issued at the federal level of the government. Most people just like having someone that they can call to or go to be like, okay, what do I do for this? What do I do for that? And that gives them, a decent program outline and what to expect from the program.
So it's more or less that you're just kind of dealing with the government to make sure that the producer, say for instance, has all their ducks in a row per se
Yes.
to get that there's
to get
not
temporary
really any
foreign
pushback.
workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So how it works is what an employer would do is apply for what's called an LMIA. So it's a labor market impact assessment. So a labor market impact assessment is issued by ESDC. And ESDC is a branch of the federal government that monitors social development and labor trends. So they will, watch to see how the labor trends are, what the employment rates are, if you can get an LMIA. They also will just kind of oversee the employers that apply. So you actually apply to ESDC for your LMIA to ensure that hiring a temporary foreign worker will not negatively impact the Canadian labor market. So in a roundabout term, LMIAs are created so that they can protect the Canadian labor market, whether that be for Canadian citizens or permanent residents of Canada.
So I know in the past, like when people were immigrating to Canada to get a job, like I know employers, like from the, say, feed industry side of things, would have to prove that they could not find the proper labor or that person's expertise within the Canadian labor market before they would issue a work permit for them. Now, is that different for temporary foreign workers, like with primary agriculture, or?
It falls fairly similarly. So there's certain expectations for a producer who's applying for a temporary foreign worker and an LMIA under the agriculture stream. So you do have to prove, generally speaking, that there is no one to fill these positions. So that would include advertising. So as of right now, the program doesn't require, under primary agriculture, we don't have to advertise to fill these positions. We have an exemption until 2020, June 2025. But normally speaking, we have to advertise for 2 consecutive weeks on 2 to 3 different platforms for the job that we're applying for the amount of positions that we're applying for. So one of those advertisements has to be on Job Bank, and then 2 other supported, like an Indeed or a Kijiji or some sort of
Yeah.
recruiting page.
Yeah. So, but you do have to put an application out on like the Canadian Job Bank and
Yeah, and you
okay.
have to have that your Canadian Job Bank ad actually matches what you're applying for within the program. So they have to match, like the wage has to match, the job duties have to match, the hours of work, it has to match to what you're applying for when you go to apply for your LMIA. There's definitely certain things that they want you to have in a row. Like I said, we currently have an exemption, so that does help employers with the LMIA application because we don't currently have to. They technically can't ask you about advertising or recruitment efforts, but like I said, that could change at any time. So they could take that away at any time, and then you'd have to go back to your advertising obligations as an employer. But as of right now, due to the labor trends and due to, the severity of employers needing employees and a lot of them hiring temporary foreign workers, we do currently have that exemption that
Yeah.
we do not have to prove any sort of advertising.
What percentage, like, do you have an understanding of like, or an idea of what percentage of, say, primary agricultural technicians in Ontario or Canada are under the
So
TFW program?
based on stats from last year from 2023, over 70,000 workers were in Ontario or were in Canada as temporary foreign workers under primary ag. And then Ontario had just over 29,000 of those
So they're
workers.
almost
So
half, they're
Ontario,
40%
yeah,
roughly.
Ontario definitely employs most temporary foreign workers. Now you have to remember primary agriculture falls, it's quite an umbrella, right? You've got like your swine, your poultry, your dairy, your nurseries, you've got all kinds of things that fall under primary, your grains that falls under primary agriculture. So I've done LMIAs for everything from like dairy, poultry. I've got a pumpkin farm that has seasonal workers, but then they also have workers on the temporary like foreign worker program that are here for 2 years.
And is that like, is the seasonal one different than the temporary one?
So seasonal is a little bit different. You do still have to apply for an LMIA, but with seasonal, you have limitations as to what countries you can hire from. And those countries actually screen the employees beforehand and have an agreement with Canada for the employees. So a lot of these seasonal farms work through different companies because they have those employees already, and those employees have been coming back for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And they have kind of CanAg that kind of arranges the travel and everything like that for them.
Yeah, because that's, I guess, where more of my background was before dairy. Like I grew up in the kind of the tobacco belt in
Yeah,
southwestern
so you've got
Ontario. So we had,
tobacco.
yeah, we had a lot of workers every year from Jamaica or Trinidad, Tobago, Mexico. They
Yeah.
would come up, but it was a lot of the same faces every year. Like with the farms that I worked with, like it was, they seemed to always bring back the same group of
Yeah, so there's a
guys.
lot of those companies. I know personally the one farm that I do work with that has seasonal workers as well as full-time 2-year term workers. They've had some guys come back for, 20, 30 years. Like it's incredible.
Yeah.
And they know the job, they've done it. So they also have restrictions as to how long they can stay. So they can actually only stay for an 8-month period. So by
Okay.
December of that year, whenever they come in by the December of that year, they have to be out of the country. Whereas with the temporary foreign worker program and doing, a primary agriculture LMIA, you can actually request your duration of employment. So that duration of employment is generally about 2 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and is there breaks or anything like that in there for them? Because I know for them it could be challenging just being away from families and
Yeah,
things like
it can
that.
be challenging, especially for a lot of, these workers coming. Never, they've either never been away from home or they have young families at home. So most do take holidays. They are allowed to take holidays. So they can go back and come back and forth because they have a visa that allows them entry and reentry into Canada. And then a lot of them, will take 2 weeks at Christmas or whatever, or take 2 weeks or a month and then go back and visit and then come back again.
Yeah, that seems like it's a little bit better for their mental
Yeah, for
health
their
for sure.
mental well-being. Yeah, their
Yeah,
mental well-being for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Well, that's just a long time to be away from kids and everything else.
Yeah, I could personally, I knowing with my own family, I couldn't imagine doing it. And I know most of these people do it because for the betterment of their family,
Yeah,
but that's still a huge and it's a big culture shock too, right? It's
yeah. Well, the
you come
cold.
into a completely the cold itself, like the winter. The winter. I know some of our guys they wear toques in 30-degree weather, and I'm like, oh gosh, guys, it's not that cold yet.
No, this is nice. Yeah.
And just
So
climate wise too, right? It's so different, right? It's such a big adjustment for them, and especially if they've never seen winter before. And winter in Ontario, as we know, can be a complete mess.
yeah. Oh, it's not the nicest place. So, what countries are you recruiting from currently? Like,
So personally, I don't do recruiting.
okay.
Recruiting requires a different. Ontario just changed its laws that recruiting requires a separate license through Service Ontario. You need a license to recruit. So I generally don't do any recruiting. I would say a lot of my clients that I work with either have had temporary foreign workers before, so they recruit amongst their own workers, or there's outside companies that they can use to recruit. But a lot will recruit amongst their own workers. For ourselves personally, we have Sri Lankan employees, so we recruit through our own workers. So they, a lot of them have worked in farms in Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. So they have lots of connections, and we just generally, once we need a new employee or someone's done their term and isn't staying, then we just reach out to them and they will send us some resumes, and then we'll do interviews over WhatsApp and hire that way. And that's, I would say, a lot of producers do it that way.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm seeing too, is like a lot of it's referrals from like they'll get in with a group or a family or whatever, then their cousin and their uncle or their
Yeah,
nephew or
exactly.
whatever.
Family. And especially, we do see a lot of employers that only apply for example, one person. So if you're only applying for one person, most people will have someone in the area that has a temporary foreign worker. So I usually say, reach out to your neighbor, talk to them if they have workers, see if you can talk to their workers, see if they know anybody. Because if you're putting one person in a home by themselves and in a job by themselves, that's fine. But they also need some sort of social aspect outside of work. So at least if they have a connection of like a neighbor or a friend down the street or someone that they know, it gives them that social connection for while they're here too, right? Someone, either to go and do something with, or a lot of them go to church. So someone to go to church with, someone to do groceries with or shopping with, or, watch a hockey game or a soccer game. So it eases that stress of coming here not knowing anybody.
Oh, just the isolation can be
Yeah. And eases
daunting
the
for
stress
them.
of the employer too, right? To know that they
Yeah.
have someone here that they kind of have a relationship with. Some people are fine to just be on their own. I've seen that before too, but most people need some sort of social connection besides, just doing it over Skype with their family at night.
So what are some of the expectations of employers when they have applied for the TFWs?
So we'll go back a little bit. So as to some of the expectations, sorry, for the LMIA. So like I said, the advertising is waived. The other thing employers have to be aware of is under primary agriculture, you have to be able to provide housing. And that housing has to be inspected and approved before you can even submit a labor market impact assessment. So I would say most farmers have, on-farm housing or off-farm housing. And generally speaking, the inspection involves your local public health unit coming in, inspecting the premises, ensuring that it's safe, ensuring that there's proper drinking water. They'll pretty much want the house set up that the temporary foreign worker is walking in today. Like they'll want
Yeah.
beds, linens, everything like that. They'll want to see that. So I just like to make that people aware of that, because sometimes people have it set up and ready to go. Sometimes people don't. There is certain cases where, a worker is already here, but they're looking to switch employers, but they already have their own house, but that's possible too. There's just a couple things that we have to, shimmy around, because you do, as an employer, have to prove that there's housing, and have to prove that there's a spot for these workers to come as if they were walking in that afternoon. They will also take, like I said, a water sample to ensure that the drinking water is safe for use. And then, as for expectations of the employer, so once the LMIA is processed and approved, the employer is responsible for arranging a flight from the worker's country of origin to Canada. So that could be, wherever they are, whether it be Mexico, the Philippines, Sri Lanka. So you, as the employer, will be responsible for that flight. You're also responsible for the trip from, say, Toronto Pearson Airport to wherever the farm is located. So a lot of people will pick up the employees themselves. A lot of people will do like an airporter type situation, depending on their distance from Pearson. The other thing employers have to be aware of is they have to make sure that there is health coverage for the employee. So in Ontario specifically, temporary foreign workers are eligible for OHIP as soon as they arrive here, but they have to apply for OHIP. They have to go into Service Ontario and apply for OHIP. So usually what I have employers do is get some sort of temporary coverage until you can know for sure that you can get them into an OHIP office. It's usually only about $25 for, a week or 2 weeks, but it at least covers them, in case there is a medical emergency within the first, couple days. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, most people never have to use it, but if you do have to use it, it's very helpful. The
Very handy.
$25 is very helpful. Yes. Now, those are, obviously things that some people don't do, but it is legally a requirement of the temporary foreign worker. And if you're ever inspected for, your LMIA or your temporary foreign workers, those are things that you're going to have to prove to the government that you have done and complied with.
What about expectations of the employee then?
So, expectations, I always say this one's kind of a hard one just because, as for employers in Ontario, anywhere in Canada, actually, we have federal and provincial expectations that we have to follow by. Expectations of the employee, you obviously try and have, solid contracts in place, an employment agreement in place. But as for the employee, there's not really a governing body which allows you, to make sure that there's certain expectations. You hope that with your, agreement that you have in place that they follow those expectations. But I always tell people it's not perfect. It's, you know what I mean? If this was the perfect solution, everybody would be doing it. It's definitely, there's plenty of stories that could go along with it. It's hard to know beforehand. You could, we've had many great employees over the years, wonderful employees, and you know what I mean? You've got a few flukes in there, right? And those are just things that you can't, like what you would have with a Canadian employee. They're just things you can't avoid.
I'd imagine some get homesick and some,
Yep. And
just
we've
get
had,
physically sick
we've had
too,
some,
right?
yeah, physically sick, and we've seen people get homesick. We've seen, I've seen people get up in the middle of the night and just leave. Like,
Yeah.
and obviously that's not what anybody wants. And you know what I mean? Most employers, I would say, try and, you know what I mean, fix the situation before it gets to that point. But it's hard once it's at that point. Sometimes it's just that's just how it's going to be. And like I mentioned, you're going to have employees that are wonderful employees, and there's always going to be bad apples in the bunch, I guess we'll say.
Yeah. Well, that's inevitable. I
It's
think,
just reality,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a lot of, I think the employee puts a lot of faith in the employer and vice versa, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
how much interaction can you really have if you're doing, a couple video chats through WhatsApp, right? Like, and
A
they're
couple video
sitting,
chats, and some of these employers don't even meet the employees beforehand. They just find a
yeah,
recruiting agency, see a resume, and go for it. And like we spoke about earlier, you have like cultural changes, you have climate changes, you have, you might put them in a house with three other workers that they don't get along with.
yeah.
And yeah, you just hope for, you obviously hope for the best. And you try and make it as accommodating as possible for these employees. But in some situations, that doesn't happen.
So through your consulting service, like, are you mostly just to get the temporary foreign worker there, or are you helping producers with, dynamics in the house and things like that in some different scenarios that they might
Yeah,
encounter?
so yeah, I would say I do kind of a roundabout way. So with my services, what I do is I assist the employer in getting the initial LMIA, and then we assist and I do all the contracts up for them, make sure these employees' names are on the LMIA, and then for the 2-year term, I I would say I assist them with all the things that come up. Like if there's, a housing issue that comes up that we can kind of resolve, or if there's a contract issue, or, if they need help with booking flights for their vacations home or things like that. I would say I pride myself in my employer client or employer my client relationships, I should say. Just because I enjoy helping employers. I don't want employers to feel like they're stuck or that they don't know what to do, or if a situation arises that they can't call me and be like, "Hey, Joanne, what do I do with this sort of situation? What do
Yeah.
how do we proceed with this? Best options." Our biggest thing that we found was when we did our first initial LMIA, we used an outside company because I didn't know anything about the process. And there was just a lot of things that I felt kind of, I should say, left in the dark about, or just unaware
Lacking.
of my yeah, unaware of
Yeah.
my responsibilities. And then to get a hold of this firm, you couldn't get a hold of them. And then at that time, one of our guys had to go to the hospital, and yeah, he had to go to the hospital, and he had a kidney stone or something. It's just a fluke thing, right? But before you know it, it's $4,000 that you have to pay. And I was like, we had no idea that we needed this private health insurance. Like
Yeah.
this company had done the LMIA, recruited them, and you know what I mean? It's not a fault of theirs either. And I wanted to make sure that when I started this business, that employers were aware of their responsibilities, they were aware of what was required of them, and they were aware that I was going to be there to help them every step of the way. If there was anything that they needed, they could call. If there was, once these, because a lot of times there is some time in between things, right? The LMIA processing is usually, once you get it submitted, it's usually within 2 to 3 weeks that you have an approved LMIA. But then, depending where you're hiring workers from, they have to apply for their work permit from their country of residence. So some work permit applications take, 2 to 3 weeks. Some work permit applications take 4 to 5 months, for example, just depending on the country of origin where these employees are coming from. So there's that gap in time, right? Where you think you're going to remember everything that you have to do, but then
It's
you
just
get to the
not a
point and you're
thing.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
you're like, oh gosh, what do we have to do? So I will say I pride myself in that they can call at any time, and we, hatch it out, figure it out, set up a plan, and go from there.
Yeah, like there's a lot of human aspects involved in this, so it's really you really be got to be on your toes, I feel.
Yeah,
Because
you've got to be on your
you don't know
toes, and it
what's
kind
going to
of,
happen when you pick the phone up, right? So
no, exactly. No, you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know if you're going to get like a panicked phone call, or if you're going to have, a calm, collective phone call. That's for sure. But it is, yeah, I do. I love my job. I love what I do. I love helping employers. And like I said, it's not always great. It's in a perfect world that, it doesn't happen. But for the most part, I would say most of my producers are very happy with the temporary foreign work program and how it helps with their current labor needs.
yeah, and I'm seeing that a lot more just in farms that I deal with. Like there's a lot of like labor, to be honest, it doesn't matter where you go in the world. Labor is the biggest issue right now in
Yeah.
primary agriculture, more than, interest rates or crop prices or feed prices or anything. Like labor, you talk to a farmer, labor is number one.
Labor is number
And
one. Yeah.
and just being worried about what they're going to wake up to in the morning, like is somebody not going to show up from work or anything, like, or is there infighting within the employees, like is this person going to quit today or that person going to quit today, like
Yeah.
it just seems like the temporary foreign workers programs kind of filled one of those little bit niches where it takes a little bit of that anxiety or angst out of it because they come up here for a reason. Like they come up here to work and provide for their families wherever they are in the world. And I would say 90 plus percent in interactions that I hear about with temporary foreign workers are positive.
Yeah. And I would say, and I would agree with you on that 100%. And that's the biggest thing, right? It's that consistency, which obviously we all know in agriculture is key. And they show up, they show up to work.
Yeah.
There's not very often that we have guys calling in, there's the odd time to have sick day or whatever, but for the most part, like it's not like you're stressing about the schedule. It's not like at 4 o'clock in the morning for milking, they're stating like, hey, I can't come. Um, Most people just say that consistency, that they show up and they're willing and wanting to work.
Well, and the thing is, I hear from a lot of producers too, is that they want more hours, but the producer
Yeah.
often, like, they want to work 70 hours a week, but that's not really feasible. They burn out. Like, people just
And
burn out.
that's
It
just
doesn't
it.
matter.
It
Yeah.
doesn't matter who you are, they burn out. And there is obligations for employers that these employees have to have one full day off per week. But a lot of these workers don't want that. But we try and keep it that they do have that full day off per week, just because, like you said, it's fine for the first couple months, but someone's going to burn out, right? Or it's going to get old quick. And you have to be realistic too that they still need that downtime as well.
Yeah. So if you take kind of a helicopter view of your clientele, like what makes it a successful experience with this process for a producer?
I would say the consistency. Like it's the biggest thing is the consistency for people and having employees that show up and that do the job, enjoy being there for the most part. Like you know what I mean? I even find like with our family farm ourselves, you walk in the barn, they're all like, hey, how are you? Like
Yeah.
they're always happy to see you. Like they're always,
Yeah.
they're always happy. I'm not saying all the time everyone's happy, but it's always you're greeted with a friendly face. We do the odd like barbecue or lunch. And last we had a neighborhood party. We invited our workers because they live just down the road in one of our houses and they love it. Like they absolutely
Yeah.
love it. They love meeting the neighbors. They love feeling involved. Even when our kids are at the farm, they love seeing our kids. They're just, I feel it's just a positive experience for most people because of the consistency and because their employees, like I said, 90% of the time enjoy being there and are happy to be there. They're also it's a different sense because they're appreciative of the work that you're giving them. Like they appreciate the job, they appreciate the opportunity, they appreciate being here in Canada, being able to work.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a
And
big cultural difference sometimes when you're dealing with people from a different country too, right? Like they're at the end of the day, they're here for one reason, and that's to provide for their families, and
yeah,
they'll go through walls to try and do that because they are
yeah,
taking a big chunk of their life away from them
yeah,
to accomplish this goal, right? So
it's a huge sacrifice that a lot of these men, and I would say primarily men, but men and women make for their families for the betterment of their families. It's a huge sacrifice.
so after the initial, like you said, it's a 2-year term that they're
Yeah.
under contract. Like what happens after that?
So after that, there's a couple different options. So, for example, some of the producers that I work with, their employees will go home for 2 years and they'll swap out employees and then they'll get new ones and then they'll kind of do a rotation. So they'll, work for 2 years, go home, provide for their family for 2 years, do the things that they haven't gotten to do with their family for 2 years. And then they'll come back again. So how it works is after 2 years, we kind of usually at the 18-month mark, I reach out to my producers, kind of obviously we've talked many times in between, but we kind of devise a plan as to how we're going to proceed. Like, are we going to proceed with the temporary foreign worker program? Are we going to look for Canadian labor? What are we going to do? Because at that point, you do have to reapply for another LMIA to prove once again that hiring a temporary foreign worker isn't going to have a negative impact on the Canadian labor market. And I would say a lot of the time the employees end up staying. So how that works is then we reapply for the LMIA, and then the employees actually apply for a new work permit from within Canada. So they can apply from within Canada and then keep working until their new work permit is issued. So that for employers is a huge benefit because then you don't have to, bring in new people and train them. The guys that you've trained for 2 years or girls can stay in that position and keep working. Like I said, there is some cultures where they do kind of 2 years on, 2 years off, 2 years. They have like a rotation of people. It kind of depends on the employer's needs at the time, and it also depends on what the employees decide to do. I would say in the majority of my producers, the initial group or the group that they have at the time that we're working on their LMIA is a group that kind of stays through. There's the odd time where you get someone that goes back for a couple of years and then chooses to come back again. But for the most part, the employees just keep renewing and stay and
Okay.
continue working.
Yeah. So like they don't necessarily have to take 2 years off. Like they can reapply for
Yeah, they
another
can
work permit.
reapply. So and how it works is their work permit will issue like an end date, and by that end date, they have to leave Canada. But if they choose to stay, they can, like I said, reapply, and then they can stay in Canada until a decision has been made on their new work permit.
I don't know if this is the right question for you or not, but is there foreign workers that are applying for their PR, like permanent residence too?
So I don't do much PR, but there is some programs that do PR in primary agriculture, and there is some that do decide to stay. There, I would say culturally, you can kind of see a variation as to different cultures. Some cultures just want to come here and work and make money and then go back home or send their money home, go back, do that swap. There is different cultures that are more apt to start working on their PR, more apt to get their spouses and children here to live and try to establish, a life here in Canada. So I would say it's probably about 50-50 of people that some choose for PR, but I would say still a large majority come here to work and they work to send their money back, but their end goal isn't to become a permanent resident.
Yeah, so and I like just from the outside looking in, I would think that's more kind of where they're from than
Yes,
anything.
yeah. And that's just it. Ethnicity or culture wise, it makes a big difference as to what their goal is here in Canada.
Is there like with our political landscape right now, I don't want to get into this too much, but like with
We're
a
not going
lot
to
of
talk
the
politics.
well, we are, but we're not. With the immigration, like I know that's kind of a hot button subject with immigration, and I know there's been some rhetoric coming from our federal government about the uh temporary foreign worker program. Like is that like how's that going to impact agriculture?
So as of right now, we're fortunate because it doesn't affect agriculture. There was changes that came into play September 26th. So I guess 2 weeks ago now. And agriculture still has the same exemptions. They won't feel the brunt of any of these changes, but that doesn't mean changes can't come. Unfortunately, until it's posted on the government website, it's all chitter chatter until it actually
Yeah.
comes. I talked to, multiple program officers in at ESDC, and I've asked them and they're like, no, until it's posted, we don't even know like what's going on, what changes will be. I can't see there being any major changes forecasted for temporary foreign workers in primary agriculture, just because if there if there is changes, then it impacts our food sector and our food security, which is a huge thing that, you know what I mean? It's already an issue in Canada. And I don't think they want to increase that issue or change that, impact that issue any more than they're already dealing with. So I can't see that there is going to be any potential changes within the next, 6 months at least to say. Now, once again, that's not saying the government can't. say tomorrow, like this is going to change and here's how we're going to do it. But just
We'll be
from
the
what we've
last to find
seen,
out.
yeah, just from what we've seen for in the case of food security amongst Canadians, I can't see them changing anything with agriculture as of right now because, as you know, if you make drastic changes to these programs, then it largely impacts many of our producers who are producing food for Canadians.
Yeah. So do they like does the government do consulting with, say, the stakeholders in agriculture when they want to propose changes to this program or do that, or is it more or
They
less
would
comes
have
from the top down?
it comes from the top down and like issues you can go to your MP or your MPP and talk to them about issues, but it comes from the top down. And the biggest thing amongst these changes that came into play is there was a lot of people taking advantage of the temporary foreign worker program, not in primary agriculture. Not to say that there's not bad actors in primary agriculture, there is in every sector. But just people selling, false LMIAs to get people here, and then people actually not working. So they just wanted to kind of try and try and cut that out, try and weed that out, try and see if we could get actual legitimate temporary foreign workers here and not have so many people working here that were technically authorized to work but technically not working in Canada. And then, well, housing on top of that, but we won't get
Yeah.
into housing. The benefits, like I said, that primary agriculture has is we've got a protected food security. As a primary agriculture producer, we also have to prove that there's housing available. So for other streams of LMIAs, they have to prove that there's affordable housing, but they don't actually have to technically provide the housing. So with us, we have to actually provide them housing. So our employees that we're bringing in, there actually has to be housing there in place for these workers, where the other streams don't necessarily, they have to prove that there's housing available, but not prove that there's actually housing that they're going to move into that day that's set up and ready to go.
Yeah, so like I guess some of it and just kind of what you read or what you see online, a lot of it was companies hiring them in urban centers.
Yeah.
And so I guess if you could prove there's affordable housing, which I don't know where there's affordable housing
I'm not sure where there's
anywhere.
affordable housing either. Yeah. And I don't know if they were just, you know what I mean? If someone posted an ad that they had a basement apartment for rent and they just,
Yeah.
because it's just, right? You could have your cousin post an ad that there's a basement apartment for $600. And I, like I said, I don't deal with that stream. So I don't know how in depth they actually look into it to see, okay, like, is this, or can you just go off that ad that's posted on Kijiji that has this apartment for rent?
Yeah, or yeah, do you put up a bunch of fake
Yeah.
fake
Fake
ads?
accounts. Yeah. Yeah. So
Sorry, I shouldn't be so cynical.
no, but it's true. It's true, right? I think there was so much going on behind the scenes, and their investigation process maybe wasn't as thorough as it could have been
Yeah.
for those situations. And well, as we all know, we're considered to be in a housing crisis, but I can't imagine that it's any better in some of those metropolitan areas where there is no housing.
Yeah. Um, and then with the temporary forward worker program, like they fall under all of our health and safety, employee
Yeah. So
laws
through,
and regulations.
yeah. So as a Ontario employer, you would have to follow any of Ontario's labor laws. So they would have the same labor standards, they would have the same rights as any Canadian worker,
Yeah, because
Canadian or permanent resident, I should say.
you hear that rhetoric too, I think, when people start talking about agriculture. Oh, they're bringing these people in and they're underpaying them and blah blah blah. And I'm like, hold your hat for a second because like it
Yeah.
was my understanding that they're under the same minimum wage laws, they're under the
They're
same
under,
health and safety laws
yeah.
that
So everything's pretty much the same. And you know what, for the employer, like it's, you always get those comments like, oh, you've got cheap labor. And technically speaking, it's not because, say, for example, you hire someone under a general farm worker position. So the wage right now meets minimum wage. So that's 17.20 per hour. You pay for their travel costs here. So whether that be flights and then their busing or whatever, you also pay for their initial health insurance. Then you get them set up for OHIP. You also provide them housing. So housing in the agriculture stream has its own stipulations as well and its own guidelines that you follow. So, for example, for a general farm worker, the maximum that you can charge them for housing per week is $30.
Yeah.
So you have to factor that in. So their housing includes like their house, where they're living, their heat, their height, like their primary utilities. And that's $30 per week. So you have to also factor that on top of their wage. Like if you were to, say, for example, rent this house out, what would you charge for rent? What would the cost of utilities be? And then factor that into their wage as well. And like I mentioned before, it's not that there's people that don't take advantage of the program, that don't take advantage of employees 100%. But most employers generally take fairly good care of
Well,
their
they can't
employees.
run their
Like
businesses without them.
they can't run their business without them. So whether that be, getting, I have a lots of employers that do like grocery gift cards as bonuses, put meat in their freezer, take them for groceries, take them to go do things. I wouldn't say that any of my producers take advantage of their employees. They're all, like you said, they can't run their business without them. And it's not that it's a cheap labor or a, fix-in labor. These are
I
people
think
that are here that want to work.
I think it sounds good on TikTok is what it comes down to, and these people that don't understand the program want to start kind of spouting off about it, right? So
Yeah. And it's also like you want to bark back like, okay, well then where are Canadian employees? Where are your kids that are in high school that should be, milking or whatever? You don't even see that anymore. And it's
no, and
unfortunate.
it's it's kind of funny because I've heard story, and this could be completely falsehood, but I've heard of a small town here in Ontario that can't keep their Tim Hortons open 24/7 because they can't find student laborers in there because the parents think it's beneath them
Yeah.
to be working at Tim
And we
Hortons.
see a
But
lot of producers too that deal with, I would say, high school students. And, you obviously don't want to ruffle any feathers here, but I know when I was a teenager, I milked. I milked for my dad, I milked for my uncle, and I had another job. And if I needed to switch shift, I figured it out. Like
yeah,
I figured it out or found someone, or I worked. If I couldn't find anyone, I worked.
yeah,
Um, you see a lot of producers that are like, well, now their parents are coming to me to, give them their schedule or tell me when and when they can't work. And it's like these kids can't even speak for themselves. And I'm not saying that's the overall consensus, but you hear that a lot more. Once again, don't want to ruffle any feathers of to anybody that's
oh, come
listening,
on, Ruffalo,
but
Joanne.
I don't want to ruffle any. But let your kids speak for themselves. Let your
We're an
kids have that
agricultural
sense
based
of
products
responsibility.
or
Yeah, let
podcast,
your kids
so
speak for themselves, and you know what I mean. Probably most of the people that are going to be listening to this,
yeah,
their kids have had. Their kids know how to handle their own, and their kids
yeah,
are quite responsible. But yeah, you see a lot of kids that that's not the case. And like I said, it's not that it's everyone, but it just becomes disappointing because, like I said, when I was in high school, there was no other option. You had to work. And if you went to a party or whatever later, that's what you did. You did your job and then you worried about your other stuff after.
yeah. Well, I'm gonna date myself here. I like when I was in high school, so I that would have been around probably when I was priming tobacco, that would have been like late 90s, early 2000s. And like our area here where I'm from, there was a lot of tobacco farms back then. And we were the last priming crew that was local workers, like high
Yeah.
school kids that would come in and work for 6 or 8 weeks during harvest to help the producer get the tobacco crop off.
Tobacco off.
And we were the last, yeah, I was probably, if not the last, the second last group
A
of
group of
locals that
students
did
that
it.
did
And
it.
everybody else had Jamaicans or workers from like Trinidad, Tobago, like island workers. And yeah, it's kind of that was only 20, wow, 25 years ago now, but
Yeah, you're like, we're not going to add a date to that. No, not going to add a date to that. But it's yeah, it's unfortunate to see, and you know what I mean. Like we talked about before, I have young kids, so I'm sure I'll struggle with that once they get to high school. And but yeah, my hope would just be that they know that they have to get a job and that they have to work hard,
yeah,
and that there's plenty of great jobs out there. I
it
loved
builds
milking cows.
character.
It was a great
Yeah,
job. It was you worked hard, you enjoyed your job, and I would hope that that will change in the future. But as
yeah,
of right now, I don't really see that changing.
yeah. We're starting to sound like old people here. So,
Yeah, let's not age ourselves too much yet.
uh, anyway, was there anything else that you'd like to add? Like anything that maybe we didn't touch on that maybe some producers should be aware of when dealing with this process?
Kind of touched on, most of the basics that people will need to know and what needs to be covered, what is expected of the employers. You could go in depth for days and days and days, I'm sure,
Yeah,
about all of the different things and the different jobs and what kind of falls under primary agriculture. Like I said, there's a list of producers that would fall under primary agriculture. And then you've got your certain job titles that fall under primary agriculture. And you kind of determine based on that and your job duties how you're going to submit your LMIA. It's fairly straightforward, I would say, in agriculture because you've either got your general farm worker or you've got a more skilled worker. So that worker would be more in dairy, for example, say like herds person, a supervisor or
yeah,
manager position. Um, Most people, when they start the process, would start with a general farm worker and then kind of take that 2 year term to see where it goes, see if there's anybody that you can bump up into more of like a supervisor position, just
yeah.
because they've, shown what they can do in 2 years. But I would say most start with a general farm worker and see kind of where the program takes you, where the employees take you, and start off on that end of the program.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I've noticed too, especially, and I think the US is leaps and bounds ahead of us here, and we're maybe just a little bit more at the beginning of the offshore labor uh, process. But like you go to farms in the US now, and it's people that have come up through their system, mostly Hispanics, but have come up and they're leading the milking crew, or they're leading the feed crew, or they're the herdsman there, and they've coached these people into these positions, and you even see them, some of them taking ownership now down in
Yeah.
the US, where they're an integral part of the organization and it doesn't run without them. So it's really exciting to see. I think on our end we're just at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
We're just at the beginning. And, I think in the States too, there's a lot of large scale producers. So when they started with foreign workers, it was really their only option to find employees. And they've navigated the process well. And I'm not saying that they all have legal workers. Um, but it's worked
for the
out well
most
for them.
part
Like you
now I
said,
think they are.
they're getting there. Yeah, they're
Yeah,
definitely getting there. And like you said, you have a crew leader who oversees all of milking because, too, if you have that language barrier, if you have a
yeah,
crew leader that, can speak English and can communicate with the employer, but then can communicate that to the employees, you need that in between person, right? It's really hard to, not that you can't show a lot of people's stuff, but that language barrier can be a struggle.
well, I think that's the biggest holdback for people entering the temporary foreign worker program is the language barrier. But it's kind of interesting to see with producers now, like a lot of barns that I go in, like everything's in English and Spanish.
Yep.
And, Google Translate gets it done. And the producers that are kind of hiring these people are taking Spanish lessons and doing stuff like that to try and get it so that, there is a better line of communication because a lot can get lost in translation. So,
Oh, 100%. And there's a couple people too. Like we have one guy here locally and he's originally from Mexico, started as a temporary foreign worker. and is now a herds person at a farm in this area. And he helps with translations too. And so a resource like that is phenomenal for people.
Yes.
And he's originally from Mexico, and like I said, has worked here for he's a PR now, or PR citizen, either or, but he does a lot of the translating and helps with, goes in and does employee meetings and helps to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Because as much as obviously the translating apps are wonderful, sometimes there's stuff that gets a little bit crossed, or like words that might be a slang that they would use more often than, say, the Google Translate version of the word. And that's been a huge assistance to employees, just to do that, every couple months, sit down, have coffee, go over the terms, make sure that everyone's on the same page, that everybody's happy, that there's nothing going on behind the scenes that isn't the employer isn't aware of.
Yeah, and he Louise from PDS has cut
That's
a
It's Louise.
yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
Louise. Of
he's
course, it's Louise.
yeah, we got
Who
to give
doesn't
him a
know
shout out
Louise?
on the podcast.
Who
Yeah.
doesn't know Louise and who doesn't
But
love
it's
Louise?
been he's been I have a few farms using him, and he's excellent, and it just helps with cleaning up milking processes and AI courses and just all the little things that, like, there's a lot of nuance in the conversation that he can pick up on because he's a native Spanish speaker,
Yes.
and that, like you said, Google Translate does not pick up on those things, right? So
No. And also you have a person like Louise, who people would probably kill to have Louise as a herds person. So he has that
yeah,
rapport, right? He
yeah,
has that
yeah,
rapport that he's like, we all love Louise, but he has that rapport that helps employers feel at ease, right? Because he does
yeah,
his job so well.
yeah. All right, Joanne. I think we covered off a lot of stuff today, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to share your
I
kind of
appreciate you having me. It
experiences.
was fun.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of those things. I say that in 10 years, like, a lot has changed in my career, and in 10 years, I think, like, there's going to be a definite split in the industry where people are going to more automation, and people are going
Yeah.
to temporary foreign workers, and there won't be a lot of in between. Like, I think you see that already in, like, the swine business now, and it's just it's inevitable that it's going to happen. So
The change is going to happen. And like you said, there's going to be people that switch to automation, but I even have farms that have automation and still have
yeah,
some temporary foreign workers for the other jobs, right? But
yeah,
there's going to be, it's either going to be one or the other, I think, within the next 5 years.
yeah. It's here. So it's
Yeah.
good to get ahead of the curve a little bit and get some information out there to producers. So no, I really
Yep.
appreciate it.
No, it's been a blast.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.